The Chicago Bulls season certainly hasn't looked the way that we have all expected it to through the first 20 games. Sitting at 8-11, the Chicago Bulls are 12th in the Eastern Conference and currently sitting out of the playoffs. But the main question that's kind of arisen is it time to hit the panic button on the Chicago Bulls team this year? So that's what I'm going to be trying to answer for you guys today. If you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe. And I truly appreciate all the support that you guys have brought to me so far this year. But with that being said, let's not waste any more of your time. Let's go and get right into things. Is it time to panic about the Chicago Bulls season? So we're only 20 games into the season, actually 19, with later today being the 20th game of the year. And the Chicago Bulls are sitting with an 8-11 record, having played a pretty tough start to the year. Now, I did mention this in previous videos. If you want to, feel free to check out some of those things, like my bold predictions, all that the Chicago Bulls were going to have a high majority of their first 20 games be against previous last year's playoff teams. I believe it was like 13 of the first 20 games were against last year's playoff teams. And based on last year's, expectations based on how last year went, it seemed like the Bulls were going to be well below 500. Now, currently they sit 3 below 500, which is still not great. But last year we saw the Bulls struggle really heavily against pretty much any playoff team. The Bulls could barely beat any team that was above 500. I think in total they had like 5 or so wins against like good, competent teams last year. Now, so far this year, they've done pretty solid, though. They're currently 6-8 against teams that are currently in the playoffs, which does mean the top 10 seeds in either conference. 6-8, pretty solid, just slightly below 500, especially for what last year looked like. It's a really good thing to see. Now, they've only played 5 teams that are currently outside the playoffs, and they are 2-3 against those teams. So again, just slightly below 500, and I believe tonight's game is against, I think it's against a team that is currently outside the playoffs, so they could quite potentially move to 3-3 if all things were to go in the right direction. But with a 6-8 against playoff teams and a 2-3 against non-playoff teams, it ain't great, but it's definitely better than a lot of us expected. So tonight's game is, actually against the Jazz. I do think the Jazz are currently still in the playoffs. I think they've fallen a little bit. I want to say they're in like the 8th seed or something. And the next 3 games are all actually against playoff teams at the current moment. So, even though the Bulls are slightly below 500 and they've struggled quite a lot through the first 20 games of the year, we're still just starting to get into the year. Yes, we're at 25%, but we've seen teams struggle a lot early on and still find a way to get in, even though they're well below 500, even worse than the Bulls currently sit at. Now, a key thing I want to look at here is kind of what the future, at least the pretty close future, is going to look like for the Bulls in this year. Not talking players, but talking teams that the Bulls are going to be facing. So, the next 13 games, 11 of the teams that the Bulls will be facing, of the 13 games, will be against current playoff teams. Now, by the time the Bulls play those teams, they could potentially slip out, especially some of those later half of the 13, like the 10th and 11th team. Maybe they fall out, depending on how some things roll out. Maybe they lose a few more games and they fall out. Maybe the Bulls jump into playoffs. A lot of things could change. But at the current moment, 11 of the next 13 games for the Chicago Bulls will be against playoff teams in this current moment. But that would bring the Bulls to 32 games on the year, and likely based on how we've seen some things, even if they do solid, it's currently sitting at a 6-8 against playoff teams, you would fall somewhere in the range of, maybe they're 4 of 6. Somewhere close to that. 4 of 6 against these 11 playoff teams, and just 1-1 against your non-playoff teams. Actually, 1-1, because there's 13 games left of them being in the playoffs. So you're falling somewhere in the range where you're still quite a bit below 500. You'd be 5 games below 500 in that scenario, and you're already 32 games into the year, just a little bit, 10 games below halfway through the season. Actually, 9 games below. You're not too far out. With 5 games below 500, you're not in a terrible position. And even if you split those next 10 games half and half, or even if you're slightly below, now you're 6, maybe 7 games below 500 at the halfway point of the year. Hopefully you're going to be seeing Lonzo Ball return. Hopefully some of the depth will be able to play out, and maybe these guys will figure out how to play a little bit better together, because even though they played a full year together, they seem to still struggle a little bit. It seems like games are either one person is doing good, two people are doing good, but it's never all three. You're never seeing Zach, DeMar, and Vooch all have a really, really good game. Maybe a couple good quarters, and based on the box score, they have a really good game, but most of the time it's not through the whole 4 quarters. All 3 of those guys are doing good. That's something we haven't seen yet. So hopefully, halfway point of the year, we can see something like that start to transpire. But with a really tough beginning of the season, first half of the season, you could start to see the Bulls in the second half of the year, whether Lonzo is able to return or not, whether things are starting to click, they're going to be in a really tight position where they're right on the edge of the playoffs and quite potentially could sneak in. Now, the East is very, very tight. We all know this. I mean, all the way from 1 to 10, I think at the beginning of the year, maybe the top 3, top 4 were kind of expected to be at the top. But the rest of the way down through the East, it could pretty much be shuffled anyway, and there wouldn't be too much of a surprise. I mean, the Heat were expected to be like a top 4 seed, and they're currently out of the playoffs, as well as the Bulls being out of the playoffs. The Wizards currently sit in the playoffs, definitely not expected. The Pacers are in the playoffs in the East. Not expected by any means. I think a lot of people thought that team was going to be fighting for a lottery, a top 5, top 10 lottery pick, and they're currently like 5th or 6th in the playoffs in the East at this current moment. They might be higher, might be a little bit lower. I don't know exactly the exact setup of the standings, but I know they're doing well above expectations. So, if the Bulls can fall in that range, where they're 5 or so below 500, I think you go all the way down to 10 below 500, you'd still be in the fight to make the playoffs at the end of the year. If they can keep this together, they could probably stay in this. So, to answer that question that I brought at the top of the show, is it time to panic for the Bulls? A lot of people maybe have been suggesting maybe it's time to trade DeMar out. Yes, it's only been 1 year, and he's been doing great, but that could bring in trade value. Maybe you trade DeMar out, bring in somebody that can make immediate impact, but also a long-term impact. Somebody a little bit younger, maybe the contract not so big. And although I don't think that's a terrible option, especially based on what it looks like at the trade deadline, maybe the Bulls are way out of playoff contention, and at trade deadline you're never really out, but you'll understand kind of what I'm saying. Maybe you trade DeMar. Maybe that is the better option at that time. But right now, I don't think so. I think DeMar brings a lot to this team. I think he works very well with what you have. You just got to learn to mesh these players together. And Billy Donovan, get back to that highest coaching level that he's been at and be a little bit more consistent. I feel like sometimes Billy Donovan is calling plays and calling shots that we normally wouldn't see, and in some games he's calling a perfect game. It's a little bit inconsistent with coaching at times as well. But I don't think it's time to already blow this team up that you just put together. I mean, the Bulls kind of went all in last year. You bring in DeMar, you bring in Lonzo Ball, you draft, I would assume you bring in Alex Caruso, and then this year you kind of round out the edges, Andre Drummond, you bring in Goran Dragic, a lot of these guys to really make this team work well together and fill in all the gaps. Defense, shooting, playmaking, all this. You filled in all these gaps, and now you just need this team to work all together and get rolling. I think this team can do it, so I don't think it's time to panic. I don't think it's time to blow this team up. And they just got to find a way to work well together. Now, the Bulls, at a 6-8 record against playoff teams, are doing better than they did last year, and they've already shown the ability to beat really good teams. They beat the Celtics twice, they beat the Bucks. I think both of those guys I think the Celtics are number 1, and I think the Bucks are number 2. So you've already beat number 1 and number 2 in the East, and number 1 twice. So the Bulls team can definitely get something together and work very well. You just got to see that work long term. If they can split some of these games against these playoff teams, especially up till the halfway point, because the back half of the season is a lot easier than the front half by a long shot. So if the Bulls can kind of get these things working together and in the back half of the season get some things rolling, get on some winning streaks, 5-win streaks, somewhere in that range, and do it pretty consistently, this team can really get some things going. I mean, last year we saw a huge burst from the Celtics. After the new year, the Celtics looked like a completely different team and even made it to the finals. Now, I'm not saying I expect the Bulls to do something similar, but I think they could do well enough to make it into the playoffs and make a good push to be not in the play-in on the back half of the season if they can just get some things working currently. But What do you guys think? Is it time to hit the panic button in the Bulls and maybe make some trades? Or do you think they just need to ride it out? I personally think they need to ride it out, but what do you guys think? I really want to hear from this Bulls community on, what's going through your guys' heads as well, because although I am making the videos, your guys' opinions matter just as much and do help me come up with my own and bring this to, more people's eyes and more people's vision. So what do you guys think? Please comment that down below. If you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe. It truly means the world to me. And as always, I hope you taught something today. Hope it made you smile, made you laugh. Something's really important to me. Affects this day in a great way. And as always, you guys all be safe out there.